September 22, 1980. 6 Iraqi divisions crossed the border into Iran along a 650-kilometer front. Saddam Hussein believes this war will last 3 weeks. It lasts 8 years. By the time it ends, over 1 million people will be dead. A generation of Iranian boys will walk across minefields holding plastic keys they were told would open the gates of paradise. Chemical gas will fall on Kurdish villages. Tankers will burn in the Persian Gulf. And 2 of the most powerful nations in the Middle East will fight each other to a bloody, pointless standstill, while the rest of the world quietly sells weapons to both sides. This is the story of the longest conventional war of the 20th century. This is the Iran-Iraq War. To understand why this war happened, you have to understand a waterway barely 200 kilometers long, the Shatt al-Arab. It's formed where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers merge, and it's the only access Iraq has to the Persian Gulf. For Iran, it's simply one border among many. But for Iraq, it's a lifeline. Whoever controls it controls Iraqi oil exports. In 1975, the 2 countries had signed the Algiers Agreement, setting the border down the middle of the waterway, the Talveg Line. Iraq hated this deal. Saddam Hussein, then vice president, had been forced to sign it after Iran cut off support to Kurdish rebels fighting inside Iraq. He never forgot the humiliation. Then, in 1979, everything changed. The Shah of Iran, a close American ally and the dominant military power in the region, was overthrown in the Iranian Revolution. In his place rose Ayatollah Khomeini, a Shia cleric who didn't just want to govern Iran. He wanted to export his revolution across the Muslim world. That was a direct threat to Saddam Hussein. Iraq was ruled by a secular, Sunni-dominated Ba'athist government, but the majority of its population was Shia. Khomeini began broadcasting radio messages into Iraq, calling on Iraqi Shias to rise up and overthrow Saddam the way Iranians had overthrown the Shah. Saddam saw an opportunity disguised as a threat. Iran's military, once the strongest in the region, was in chaos. Thousands of officers had been purged or executed for loyalty to the old regime. The country was isolated internationally after the seizure of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Its army was starved of American spare parts it had relied on for a decade. Saddam believed Iran was weak, divided, and alone. He believed a quick, decisive strike could tear up the Algiers Agreement, seize the oil-rich Iranian province of Khuzestan, and crush the revolution before it could spread across the border. He was wrong on almost every count. On September 17, 1980, Saddam stood before the Iraqi National Assembly and tore up the Algiers Agreement on live television. 5 days later, the invasion began. Iraqi jets struck 10 Iranian airbases in a surprise attack modeled on Israel's opening strike in the 1967 Six-Day War. But it failed. Iranian runways were hardened, aircraft were dispersed in shelters, and the damage was minimal. Iran's Air Force, still flying American F-4 Phantoms and F-14 Tomcats, was bruised, not broken. On the ground, Iraqi armor rolled into Khuzestan along 3 axes, aiming for the cities of Dezful, Awaz, and the vital port of Khorramshahr. For the first weeks, Iraq advanced. But the advance was slow, cautious, almost hesitant, as if Saddam's generals themselves doubted the plan. Iraqi forces besieged Khorramshahr, and what followed was a preview of the brutal, grinding war to come. Iranian defenders, regular soldiers alongside the newly formed Revolutionary Guard, the Pasdaran, and armed civilian volunteers, fought street to street. The city became known in Iran as Khorramshahr, the City of Blood. It took Iraq 34 days of urban combat to capture it. Iraq's 3-week war was already unraveling. By early 1981, the front lines had frozen. Saddam's forces held territory inside Iran but lacked the strength to push further. Iran, meanwhile, was rebuilding. Under the banner of the Islamic Revolution, Iran mobilized in a way few outsiders expected. The Revolutionary Guard swelled with volunteers. The Basij, a paramilitary militia of civilians, many of them teenagers, was formed, driven by religious fervor and the promise of martyrdom. In September 1981, Iran broke the siege of Abadan. In March 1982, Operation Undeniable Victory smashed through Iraqi lines near Desful, destroying entire armored divisions. And in May 1982, Iran recaptured Khorramshahr in a massive, costly offensive, inflicting devastating losses on the retreating Iraqi army. Iraq had lost virtually all the territory it had seized in 1980. Saddam offered a ceasefire. Khomeini refused. This is the pivotal, tragic turning point of the war. Iran had achieved what it needed to for a negotiated peace. Instead, Khomeini declared the goal was now the total overthrow of Saddam Hussein's government, and the war shifted from Iranian territory onto Iraqi soil. It was a decision that would cost hundreds of thousands more lives, and prolong the war for 6 more years. What followed was some of the most horrifying warfare of the modern era. Facing Iraq's superior armor, artillery, and air power, Iran leaned on the one resource it had in surplus, manpower. Beginning with Operation Ramadan in July 1982, Iran launched a series of massive offensives against fortified Iraqi positions around Basra. Iraq had dug in trenches, minefields, artillery batteries, and interlocking machine gun fire turned the border into something resembling the Western Front of World War I. Iran's answer was the human wave assault. Waves of Basij militia, including boys as young as 13, advanced across minefields, sometimes unarmed, to clear paths for the regular army behind them. Some were given small plastic or painted keys, told they were keys to paradise, martyrdom guaranteed if they died fighting for the Islamic Republic. The offensives, Ramadan in 1982, Operation Before the Dawn in 1983, Operation Dawn 5 and 6 in 1984, gained little ground and cost staggering casualties. Iraq, dug into strong defensive positions and increasingly willing to use chemical weapons, held the line around Basra again and again. The war had become one of attrition. Both sides were bleeding a generation into the sand, and neither would stop. Unable to break through on the ground, both nations turned to a new form of warfare, terrorizing each other's civilians. Beginning in 1984, Iraq launched Scud missiles and conducted long-range bomber raids on Iranian cities, including Tehran. Iran retaliated with missile strikes of its own on Baghdad and other Iraqi cities. These exchanges came in several intense rounds, the War of the Cities, with civilians on both sides living under the threat of sudden missile strikes with almost no warning. At the same time, the war spilled into the Persian Gulf itself. Iraq began attacking tankers carrying Iranian oil, hoping to cripple Iran's economy. Iran responded by attacking tankers serving Iraq's Gulf allies, particularly Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. This became known as the Tanker War, and by the mid-1980s, hundreds of commercial vessels had been damaged or sunk in the Gulf. The Tanker War internationalized the conflict. Kuwait, fearing for its oil exports, asked the United States and the Soviet Union to protect its tankers. Washington agreed to reflag Kuwaiti tankers under the American flag, and by 1987, U.S. Navy warships were directly patrolling the Gulf, putting American forces on a collision course with Iran. Officially, most of the world declared neutrality. In reality, nearly every major power was arming one side or both. The Soviet Union, and later even China, sold Iraq tanks, artillery, and aircraft. France supplied Iraq with Mirage fighter jets and Exocet missiles. The Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait especially, poured billions of dollars into Iraq's war effort, terrified of what an Iranian revolutionary victory would mean for their own monarchies. The United States, despite officially declaring neutrality, restored diplomatic relations with Iraq in 1984 and provided intelligence, agricultural credits, and, critically, turned a blind eye as Iraq used chemical weapons on the battlefield. And then there was Iran-Contra. In one of the strangest episodes of the Cold War, the United States secretly sold arms to Iran, the same country it had branded a sponsor of terrorism and refused to publicly support, in a bid to secure the release of American hostages held in Lebanon. The profits were then illegally diverted to fund Contra rebels fighting in Nicaragua. When the scandal broke in 1986, it humiliated the Reagan administration. But it also revealed a brutal truth about this war: for the great powers, Iran and Iraq weren't allies or enemies. They were markets. Beginning as early as 1983, Iraq turned to a weapon banned by international law since 1925, poison gas. Iraqi forces used mustard gas and nerve agents like tabun and sarin against Iranian troops massing for offensives, particularly around the southern front and the Fa Peninsula. Entire units were wiped out or left with permanent injuries, blindness, burned lungs, disfigured skin. Iran repeatedly brought evidence to the United Nations. The international response was muted at best. Then, in March 1988, came the atrocity that would define the chemical war in the world's memory: Halabja. Iraq accused the Kurdish town of Halabja of collaborating with Iranian forces during a joint Iranian-Kurdish offensive. In retaliation, Iraqi aircraft bombarded the town with a mixture of chemical agents over several days. Estimates suggest between 3,000 and 5,000 civilians were killed almost immediately. Men, women, and children suffocated or poisoned in the streets and in their homes. Thousands more suffered long-term injuries and birth defects in the years that followed. Halabja became one of the largest chemical weapons attacks on a civilian population in history. At the time, the international response was almost silent. It would take years, and a second war in 2003, before the world fully reckoned with what happened there. By 1988, after years of stalemate, the momentum shifted decisively toward Iraq. Iran's economy was collapsing under the weight of the war. Years of human wave offensives had drained its manpower and morale. Meanwhile, Iraq, bolstered by billions in Gulf Arab financing and Soviet and Western weaponry, had rebuilt and modernized its military, and begun deploying chemical weapons more systematically against both military and civilian targets. In the spring of 1988, Iraq launched a series of rapid offensives, the Tawakkalna ala Allah operations, retaking the Fa Peninsula, which Iran had held since 1986, in a matter of days. City after city, position after position, ground Iran had spent years and enormous casualties capturing was lost within weeks. At sea, tensions with the United States exploded into open combat. In April 1988, after the USS Samuel B. Roberts struck an Iranian mine, the U.S. Navy launched Operation Praying Mantis, the largest American surface naval engagement since World War II, sinking or crippling several Iranian vessels and oil platforms in a single day. Then, on July 3, 1988, came a tragedy that shocked the world. The USS Vincennes, operating in the Persian Gulf, mistook Iran Air Flight 655, a civilian passenger jet, for an attacking military aircraft, and shot it down. All 290 people on board were killed. For Iran's leadership, it was a devastating signal. If the United States was now willing to strike Iranian targets directly, the war Iran had fought since 1980 could no longer be won. On July 20, 1988, Ayatollah Khomeini accepted United Nations Security Council Resolution 598, calling for an immediate ceasefire. He described the decision in words that would become infamous, comparing it to drinking a cup of poison. For a leader who had refused peace at Iran's moment of maximum advantage in 1982, and who had promised total victory over Saddam Hussein, ending the war on these terms was a bitter, humiliating concession. The formal ceasefire took effect on August 20, 1988. 8 years of war ended not with victory for either side, but with both armies roughly back where they had started, along almost the exact same border that had existed before the first Iraqi tank crossed into Khuzestan in September 1980. The final cost of the Iran-Iraq War is almost impossible to comprehend. Estimates of the dead range from 500,000 to over 1 million people, the vast majority of them soldiers, many of them teenagers. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded, gassed, or maimed. Millions were displaced. Both economies, once flush with oil wealth, were shattered, with damages estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And what had actually changed? The border dispute over the Shatt al-Arab that started it all was resolved on almost the same terms as the 1975 agreement Saddam had torn up on live television 8 years earlier. But the consequences rippled forward for decades. Iraq emerged from the war deeply in debt, much of it owed to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, the same Gulf states that had financed Saddam's war against Iran. Saddam's demands that this debt be forgiven, combined with a dispute over oil production and territory, would help drive his invasion of Kuwait just 2 years later, in 1990, triggering the Gulf War, and setting in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead to the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. Iran, isolated and economically devastated, turned inward, hardening the revolutionary state that Khomeini had built and shaping a deep, lasting suspicion of the West, and particularly the United States, that continues to define Iranian foreign policy today. And in the town of Halabja, and countless other villages and battlefields across the Iran-Iraq border, the physical scars of chemical warfare are still being counted, in cancer rates and birth defects, more than 3 decades later. The Iran-Iraq War rarely appears in Western textbooks the way other 20th-century conflicts do. It has no iconic ending, no clear victor, no single defining image seared into global memory the way other wars have. But for 8 years, it was the deadliest conflict on Earth, a war fought with First World War tactics and Cold War weapons, fueled by revolution, religion, and the ambitions of 2 men who dragged their nations into a war that changed the Middle East forever, and whose consequences the world is still living with today.